During a Christmas dinner, I watched my son-in-law grab my daughter and throw her against the wall. His father only smiled and said, "Good. That's how you teach someone who doesn't know their place." My blood boiled, but I stayed calm, helped my daughter stand, and made one phone call that would change everything. 15 minutes later, 12 black Rolls-Royces surrounded the house, and everyone inside realized they had awakened someone they never should have underestimated that unforgettable night before. I'm so grateful to have you here on Dad's Revenge Stories to help our community grow. Please comment below with your city or country. Note: this storyline contains fictionalized elements crafted for dramatic effect. While names and settings are coincidental, the underlying message is crafted to inspire. The text message came on a Wednesday afternoon, short enough to fit on half my thumbnail. Christmas dinner Friday, Ethan's place, 7 o'clock. Claire says she'd love to see you. Not from Claire. From Ethan's assistant, a woman named Brenda, whose name I'd seen on 3 previous messages this year, each one relaying something my daughter apparently wanted me to know but couldn't find the time to say herself. I read it twice, standing at my workbench, holding a carburetor I'd been cleaning for the better part of an hour, grease on my fingers and the smell of solvent in the air, and I thought about the last time I heard Claire's actual voice, 4 months ago. Late August. She called on a Sunday evening and the call lasted 9 minutes. I know because I checked afterward the way you check a wound to see how deep it goes. She asked about my knee. I asked about her work. She said she wasn't working right now, that she and Ethan had decided it made more sense for her to focus on the home. Her voice when she said it had a particular flatness, the kind that isn't sadness exactly, but is what sadness sounds like after it's been smoothed over and set out to dry. I said that sounded like a big change. She said it was fine. Then Ethan's voice came from somewhere in the background, not words I could make out, just a tone, and Claire said she had to go and that she'd call me soon. That was 4 months ago. She did not call soon. She did not call at all. My name is Richard Calloway. I am 67 years old. I live alone in a house on Birchwood Lane in Wethersfield, Connecticut, a 2-story colonial with a detached garage that takes up more of my time than the house does, which is the way I prefer it. My neighbors know me as the retired man who waves from his driveway and keeps his gutters clean and sometimes has a light on in the garage past 10 at night. The woman at the hardware store on Route 34 calls me by my first name and asks about my knee, same as Claire did, and I appreciate that more than I probably should. What my neighbors do not know, what the woman at the hardware store does not know, what my son-in-law, Ethan Whitmore, has never once considered knowing, is what I did for 31 years before I moved into this house and started spending my evenings with carburetors and old wood and the particular silence that comes when a man has decided he is finished being loud. I set the carburetor down on the workbench. I wiped my hands on a shop rag. I looked at the text message one more time, and then I looked at my car, a 2008 Buick LeSabre, the color of old pewter. And I made a decision, the way I have made most decisions in my life, quietly and without consulting anyone. I was going to dinner. The drive to Glastonbury takes 22 minutes on a clear night, less if you take the highway. But I took the back roads because I wanted the time. I had been taking those 22 minutes for the better part of 2 years, and I had learned things along the way, the kind of things you learn when you give yourself time to think instead of rushing toward the destination. I had learned that Claire stopped calling me directly sometime around January of that year. I had learned that every invitation since March had come through Ethan or Ethan's people. I had learned that the birthday card I mailed in September, the one with the small painting of a lighthouse, I did myself, because Claire once told me she loved lighthouses, came back to me 3 weeks later, with return to sender written across the front in handwriting that was not Claire's. I had not told anyone about that card. There are things you hold on to privately, not because they don't matter, but because they matter too much to say out loud before you fully understand what they mean. The tires hummed on the wet asphalt. December in Connecticut has a particular quality of cold, not the sharp theatrical cold of January, but a heavy, settled cold that comes up through the ground and sits in your chest. The kind of cold that makes you think about warmth, about kitchens and lamplight, and the sound of another person breathing in the same room. Claire grew up in that kind of cold. She used to press her face against the car window on nights like this and tell me the streetlights looked like dandelions. She was 9 years old when she said that. She is 34 now. I turned onto Ridgefield Drive and the houses got larger, the driveways longer, the Christmas lights more elaborate. 3-car garages behind iron gates. Landscaping that costs more per month than some people pay in rent. I passed a stone mailbox with the name Hargrove on it in brass letters, and I remembered that Ethan had mentioned the Hargroves at some point, something about a shared investment, the kind of casual name-dropping that tells you more about a man than his actual words do. Then I came around the bend and saw it. The Whitmore house rose up behind a curved driveway lined with white birch trees wound in fairy lights. A structure that was less a home than a statement, all stone facade and tall windows and a front door that cost more than my car. Every window glowed warm and golden. Expensive cars crowded the driveway, a Range Rover, 2 sedans with dealer plates, a white Mercedes that caught the fairy lights and threw them back in pieces. I pulled my Buick in behind them and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. My daughter was inside that house. I thought about the 9-minute phone call. I thought about the birthday card. I thought about her voice saying it's fine in that particular way. That means the opposite. The way it has always meant the opposite. The way I should have recognized sooner, the way I was recognizing now, sitting in my car in a stranger's driveway, with grease still under my thumbnail, because I hadn't cleaned it thoroughly enough. I got out of the car. The cold hit me across the face like a word I hadn't expected. I straightened my jacket, the good charcoal one that Margaret picked out for me 12 years ago, and that still fits because I have not changed much since then. Or at least I tell myself I have not. I walked toward the front door. The sound of voices and music floated through the stone walls, warm and distant, the sound of a party in full motion. Somewhere inside that sound was my daughter's voice, and I had not heard it in 4 months, and I was about to. I rang their doorbell. The door opened almost immediately, and it was not Claire. Ethan Whitmore opened his own front door, which surprised me. A house this size usually has someone else to do that. He was taller than I remembered, broad across the shoulders, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, with the collar open just enough to look intentional. He had the kind of face that photographs well-jaw-defined eyes, pale and alert, the sort of man who learned early that his appearance was an asset and has been managing it carefully ever since. He smiled when he saw me, wide and immediate, the smile already in place before his eyes had finished deciding what they thought of what they were seeing. "Richard." He said my name like he was confirming an item on a checklist. "Glad you made it." He shook my hand. His grip was firm, practiced the handshake of a man who has read about handshakes. His eyes moved over me once quickly, taking in the charcoal jacket, the Buick visible behind me in the driveway, and I watched him file whatever conclusions he drew into whatever folder he kept for men like me. "Come on in," he said, and stepped aside. The house hit me the way cold water hits you. Not unpleasant exactly, but a shock to the system. Everything was large and pale and deliberately beautiful. Ceilings that climbed to somewhere above my comfort level. A staircase that curved like something from a magazine. Furniture that looked chosen by someone paid to choose furniture, everything matching in ways that real homes never quite match, because real homes accumulate rather than coordinate. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, 12 feet tall, and decorated in gold and white, not a single ornament out of place. It was the most perfect Christmas tree I had ever seen and the least cheerful. The sound of other voices came from deeper inside the house, the particular murmur of a gathering that is already well underway, glasses clinking, laughter arriving in short, controlled bursts. Ethan led me through the entryway, and I followed. Noting the framed photographs on the wall, all of them recent, all of them featuring Ethan and Claire at various events, dinners, a beach somewhere warm, a ski resort. Claire was smiling in every photograph. It took me until the fourth one to notice the smiles never quite reached her eyes. Then she appeared at the end of the hallway. My daughter walked toward me in a green dress I had never seen before, her hair arranged in a way that looked effortful. And my first thought was that she was beautiful, and my second thought, arriving so quickly behind the first that they nearly collided, was that she looked exhausted in a way that makeup could not fully cover. Dad. Her voice broke slightly on the word, just slightly, the way a floorboard gives when you step on the wrong spot. She hugged me, and I held on a moment longer than she expected, long enough to feel her exhale against my shoulder. She smelled like a perfume I didn't recognize. The perfume she wore when she lived in her own apartment, the one Margaret had given her for her 25th birthday, had smelled like orange and something warmer underneath. This was different. Chosen by someone else, maybe. Or chosen to please someone else, which amounts to the same thing. You look wonderful. I told her because she did, and because some truths exist alongside other truths. You too, Dad. She touched my arm, and then her eyes moved sideways to Ethan, a quick, involuntary check, the way you check a stove to make sure you turned it off. He was already turning toward the living room, gesturing for us to follow. The other guests were gathered around the sitting area and the long dining table beyond it. 10 people, perhaps 12. The men in blazers, the women in heels, everyone holding something. Victor Whitmore stood near the fireplace with a glass of bourbon, and he was the kind of man a room reorganizes itself around, whether it intends to or not. 65 years old, broad-chested, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly pension, and wearing it like he'd been born in it. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately appraise. "Victor, you remember Claire's father," Ethan said. "Richard." Of course. Victor's handshake was different from his son's. Heavier, less managed. The handshake of a man who stopped worrying about impressions a long time ago, because impressing people is something other people do. "Richard, good of you to come out." Out. As though I had traveled from somewhere inconvenient. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. A woman I didn't know handed me a glass of sparkling water without asking what I wanted, and I accepted it and found a position near the edge of the room where I could see most of it without being in the middle of it. An old habit. 31 years of old habits. I watched Claire move through the room. She refilled glasses before they were empty. She laughed at things before they finished being funny. When Ethan spoke to the group, she stood slightly behind him, and to his left, the position of someone who has learned exactly how much space they are permitted to occupy. Once a woman asked her a direct question about the house renovation, and Claire opened her mouth to answer, and Ethan answered instead smoothly, without pausing, the way you change a radio station without looking at your hand. Claire closed her mouth. She picked up a napkin from the table and folded it. I kept my face still, and I kept my eyes moving, and I held the glass of sparkling water, and I began, as I have done in many rooms over many years, to pay very careful attention. Then I saw it. Claire reached across the side table for a coaster, her sleeve pulling back 2 inches, and there on the inside of her wrist was a mark that made me realize something was seriously wrong. The sparkling water had gone flat in my glass. I set it down on the nearest surface and did not pick it up again. Dinner was announced by a woman in a black uniform who appeared from the kitchen and spoke quietly to Ethan, and Ethan clapped his hands once and said, "All right, everyone, let's eat." The way a man speaks when he has decided that a room full of people moving according to his word is simply the natural order of things. The dining table seated 14. I counted the chairs before I sat down, an old habit from rooms where counting things told you something useful. The table was set with candles and cloth napkins folded into shapes, crystal glasses that caught the candlelight and threw it around the room in small pieces. A centerpiece of white pine and red berries ran the length of it. Ethan sat at the head. Victor sat at his right. Claire sat 3 chairs down on the left side, close enough to the middle to suggest she belonged there, far enough from her husband that the suggestion remained only that. I was directed to a chair at the far end, the auxiliary end, the end where the table narrowed slightly and the candles were fewer. A woman named Diane, the wife of one of Ethan's business associates, sat beside me and smiled in the polite way of someone who has been placed next to a stranger and is making the best of it. "So how do you know Ethan and Claire?" she asked. "Claire is my daughter," I said. Her smile shifted into something warmer and more complicated. "Oh, of course. I didn't realize." She glanced down the table toward Claire, and then back at me, and I could see her recalibrating, filing away something she had noticed, but not yet named. I understood. I was seated further from my daughter than the Hargroves, further than the business associates, further than the woman who did Ethan's accounting. I was at the end of the table because that was where Ethan had put me, and Ethan had put me there because that was what I was to him. The peripheral detail, the tolerated obligation. The quiet old man from Wethersfield who drove an old car and fixed engines and had nothing useful to contribute to a table like this one. I unfolded my napkin and set it on my knee. The first course arrived. Ethan's voice rose above the others naturally, the voice of a man who has never had to raise it to be heard, because the rooms he occupied had always arranged themselves around his frequency. He talked about a development project in Fairfield County, a mixed-use space, 40 units of luxury residential above ground-floor retail. He used words like footprint and build-out and absorption rate, the vocabulary of a man who wanted you to know he spoke a language you probably didn't. "Richard," Ethan said, and his voice carried the full length of the table with effortless precision, the way a stone skips across still water. "What did you say you did before you retired?" Several faces turned toward me. Diane shifted in her seat. "I was in transportation," I said. "Logistics." Ethan nodded slowly, the nod of a man performing consideration. "Logistics." He said the word the way you repeat a word in a foreign language you are not planning to learn. "So driving dispatch, that kind of thing." "That kind of thing," I said. Victor made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Honest work," he said in the tone men use when they mean the opposite, when they mean the work of men with limited options. "Nothing wrong with keeping the wheels turning. Somebody has to." "Somebody does," I agreed. Ethan smiled at his father and then at the table generally. "I always say the backbone of any economy is the people doing the ground-level work. Without them, none of the rest of it functions." He gestured loosely in my direction as he said it. A generous gesture, a charitable gesture, the gesture of a man tossing a coin into a fountain. He picked up his wineglass. "To the ground-level work." 2 or 3 people echoed it. Glasses rose. I lifted my water glass and touched it to nothing. I looked at Claire. She was looking at her plate. Her fork moved through her food in small, purposeless strokes, the motion of someone who has learned to perform eating without committing to it. Her shoulders carried a tension that I recognized now with the cold clarity of a man who should have recognized it months ago. It was the tension of a person who has spent so long monitoring the emotional weather of a room that their body has forgotten how to stop. I thought about the table we had at home when Claire was growing up. A round oak table I bought second-hand from an estate sale in Middletown, the year after Margaret and I moved to Wethersfield. It had a burn mark on one edge from a candle that fell over during a power outage in '98, and a scratch along the side from the time Claire tried to teach herself to roller skate in the dining room at age 7. We ate every dinner at that table for 14 years. Nobody sat at the far end. There was no far end. It was a circle. Ora tichatino. The development in Fairfield, one of the guests said to Ethan, pulling the conversation back. Is that the one you mentioned last spring, the Millbrook project? Ethan's expression moved through something quickly, a tightening around the eyes gone before most people would notice it. We rebranded that one, he said smoothly. New partners, new direction. The fundamentals are strong. I heard there were some delays, the man said. Construction always has delays. Ethan's voice stayed easy, but his right hand found the base of his wine glass and held it. The important thing is the long-term position. Victor, tell them about the Hartford opportunity. Victor began to speak, and the table's attention shifted like a school of fish turning in unison, and Ethan's hand slowly released the wine glass, and I watched all of it and said nothing, and remembered everything. At the far end of the table in the chair I had been assigned, I was exactly where Ethan wanted me. He had no idea that was also exactly where I wanted to be. The conversation turned the way dinner conversations do through business and weather and the vague optimism people perform at Christmas, until a woman across the table, one of the associates' wives with pearl earrings and a kind face, leaned toward Claire and asked, "Are you still doing that interior design work? I remember Ethan mentioning it at the Hargroves last spring." Claire straightened in her chair. Something moved across her face, brief and unguarded, the expression of a person who has been asked about a room they used to live in and no longer do. I actually stepped back from that, she said. We decided it made more sense for me to. Claire's focus is the home now, Ethan said from 3 chairs away, without looking up from his plate. His voice was pleasant and final, the voice of a man summarizing a memo. It's a full-time job, honestly, running a house like this properly. She's incredible at it. The woman with pearl earrings smiled at Claire. That's lovely. Claire smiled back. Thank you, she said, and picked up her fork, and I watched the door close behind her eyes. I remembered the phone call, Claire's voice coming through the line with a particular quality I had learned to pay attention to over 67 years of paying attention to things. She told me she was thinking about stepping back from her clients, that Ethan felt the house needed more of her time, that it made sense financially for her to focus on their life together, rather than building something separate. I had asked her what she wanted. She had paused for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. I think this is the right move for us, she said. Not for me, for us. The pronoun of a woman who has stopped locating herself in her own sentences. Claire had graduated top of her class from the University of Connecticut with a degree in design. She had spent 3 years building a client list from nothing, driving herself to appointments in a car with a broken heater, carrying sample books up 4 flights of stairs in buildings without elevators, calling people back within the hour, because she knew that responsiveness was the thing that separated her from everyone else. She had called me one evening from a parking lot in New Haven, so excited she could barely form complete sentences because a client had referred her to a hotel group interested in redesigning 2 properties in Hartford. That was 4 years ago. She was 30 years old, and she was building something, and she was happy in the specific way of a person doing exactly what they were made to do. Ethan proposed 8 months later. I had liked him at first. That is the honest accounting of it, and I will not soften it. He was charming and attentive, and he looked at my daughter the way a man looks at something he values, and I had confused that look with love when it was closer to possession. Those two things can appear identical from a distance. It is only when you are close enough and patient enough and sitting at the far end of a long table on a Friday night in December that you begin to see the difference. She designed the whole east wing herself. Ethan continued gesturing toward the back of the house, addressing the pearl earring woman now, as though Claire were a feature of the property rather than a person at the table. The tile in this main bathroom, the built-ins in my office, all of it. Incredible eye. It really is beautiful, the woman said, and looked at Claire warmly. Thank you, Claire said again. The same two words. The same closed door. I watched Ethan reach over and place his hand on Claire's shoulder, a gesture that read as affectionate from across the table, the kind of gesture you might photograph and post somewhere to demonstrate a happy marriage. But Claire's body responded the way it had responded to his hand in the entryway, a barely perceptible stiffening, a tightening in the muscles just below the surface. The involuntary language of a person whose body has learned something their mind is still negotiating. She did not lean into his hand. She did not move away from it either. She had learned to hold very still. Margaret used to say that the bravest thing a person could do was want something openly without apology, without hedging it into something smaller and safer. She said this to Claire when Claire was 15 and embarrassed to tell her friends she wanted to study art. She said you must never let anyone talk you into wanting less than what you actually want, because the wanting is not the problem, the wanting is the whole point. Margaret said this, and then she died before she could see what happened to the girl who had listened. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate precisely without sound. Across the table, Victor was telling a story about a real estate deal in '94. His voice rolling through the room like something that had been rolling through rooms for decades and expected the rooms to accommodate it. Ethan was laughing the right amount in the right places. The candles burned straight in the windless room, and my daughter sat 3 chairs from her husband and 8 chairs from her father, and ate without tasting, and spoke without saying anything, and smiled without meaning it. And I understood with the particular cold clarity of a man who has run out of reasons not to understand that she had been disappearing for 2 years, slowly in increments small enough that each one alone meant nothing, and I had been letting her. That stopped tonight. I did not know yet exactly what tonight would require, but I knew what it would not allow. It would not allow me to drive home at the end of it and do nothing. Victor Whitmore had a voice built for large rooms. It was the kind of voice that did not need to compete, because it had never learned that competing was an option. He set down his bourbon, straightened in his chair, and began talking about the Whitmore family, the way men like him always talk about their families, as though history were a thing they had personally constructed and were now generously allowing others to inhabit. 3 generations, he said, holding up 3 fingers for the benefit of the table. My grandfather broke ground on his first project in '51, a warehouse in Bridgeport, 4,200 square feet. Nothing impressive by today's standards, but back then that was something. That was a man saying, I am going to build something that outlasts me. He looked at Ethan. That's the Whitmore way. You build. You don't wait for someone to hand it to you. Ethan nodded with the practiced gravity of a man who has heard this particular sermon many times and understood that his role was congregation, not clergy. Ethan's picked up that torch. Victor continued gesturing toward his son, the way you gesture toward a monument you commissioned yourself. The Bridgeport warehouse is a tech hub now. We did that conversion 2 years ago. 60,000 square feet fully leased, And the new developments coming online, well. He smiled at the table. Let's just say the family is not done building. Several guests murmured appreciatively. Someone asked about the Hartford project, the same project Ethan had redirected away from 40 minutes ago, and I watched Ethan's jaw tighten by a degree most people at the table would not notice. The Hartford opportunity is in the final structuring phase. Ethan said, picking up the thread from his father before Victor could answer, which told me something. Men who are confident in their numbers let other people ask about them. Men who are managing a problem redirect before the question can land. We're being selective about partners, quality over speed. Smart, said the man who had asked. He nodded and returned to his salmon. I picked up my water glass and looked at Ethan over the rim of it. 2 years ago, the first Christmas dinner I had attended at this house, Ethan had described the Hartford project in specific terms. 40 units, mixed commercial, ground broken by spring. He had used the word transformative 3 times in one conversation, and I had filed that away the way I file things, without comment, without conclusion, waiting for the information to mean something. It was still waiting. Spring had come and gone twice. The project was still in its final structuring phase. The language around it had changed, grown softer and more general, the way language always does when the specifics have become inconvenient. I had spent 31 years listening to men describe things that did not exist in the precise tones of things that did. And I knew the sound of it, the way a musician knows a flat note, not because they are thinking about it, but because their ear has been trained past the point of being able to not hear it. My phone vibrated once in my jacket pocket. I excused myself to Diane beside me with a small gesture and looked at the screen under the edge of the table. A message from Daniel Brooks, the same Daniel who had texted earlier in the evening. We had known each other for 28 years, since the early days when I was building the company, and he was a 26-year-old operations manager who worked harder than anyone I had hired before or since. When I sold the company 12 years ago, Daniel was the one I sold it to, or rather the one I sold it through, because the holding group that acquired it was largely his architecture. The message said, "Still in Glastonbury, saw your car on the GPS. Everything good. I had not told Daniel I was coming tonight. He knew because he had access to the emergency location share we had set up years ago, a relic of a time when both of us were traveling through places where knowing where the other person was mattered. I had never turned it off. Neither had he. I typed back, "Fine. Dinner with Claire. Stay close tonight." 3 dots appeared immediately, then, how close? I thought about Victor's voice filling the room. I thought about Ethan's hand redirecting the conversation. I thought about the Millbrook project that got rebranded and the Hartford project in perpetual final structuring, and the financial vocabulary of a man who talked constantly about building things and never seemed to finish any of them. I thought about the mark on Claire's wrist, the shape of a thumb yellowing at the edges. I typed, "Close enough to move if I need you to." The 3 dots again. Then, already moving. Say the word. I put the phone back in my pocket. "Richard." Victor's voice found me from the far end of the table, carrying the particular tone of a man who has just remembered something small requires his attention. "You were in logistics, Ethan tells me. Did you run your own operation or work for someone else?" Every face at the table turned toward me again. Claire's turned with them, and for just a moment her eyes held something that was not the careful blankness she had been maintaining all evening. It was something older than that. It was the look she used to give me when she was 10 years old, and something was happening at school that she did not yet have the words for, a look that said, "I know you see this, and I need you to keep seeing it." "I ran my own operation," I said. Victor nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing an answer in a folder marked inconsequential. "Good for you," he said. "Small business is the backbone of this country." "It is," I agreed. He turned back to his bourbon. The table's attention drifted away from me like smoke. I looked at my daughter. She had turned back to her plate, but her shoulders had dropped just slightly, just 1 degree, and I understood that she had heard something in my answer that the rest of the table had not. Good, I thought. She should. Ethan waited until Victor had finished his bourbon and the table had settled into the comfortable murmur of the second course, before he leaned back in his chair and looked down the length of the table at me with the expression of a man who has decided to be generous. "So Richard," he said loud enough for the nearest 6 guests to hear without making it obvious he wanted them to. "Dad asks what you did. You said logistics. But what does that actually mean?" "Day to day, I mean. Routing, scheduling." "What was the operation?" There was nothing hostile in his voice. That was the precise skill of it. He had asked the question, the way you ask a child, to explain what they drew with patience and mild encouragement, as though the answer would be charming regardless of what it was. Several heads turned. Diane beside me had gone very still in the way of someone who senses that a conversation is about to reveal something she did not know was available to be revealed. I set down my fork. "I moved things," I said, "from where they were to where they needed to be." Ethan smiled. "Sure. But at what scale?" "Like a few trucks, regional." "We had operations in 11 states at the peak," I said, "and 4 partnerships overseas." A brief pause. Not long. A half-second, maybe less. But I had been watching faces across tables for 3 decades, and I knew what a half-second of recalibration looked like. "Huh." Ethan reached for his wine glass. "So a mid-size regional outfit. That's solid. Good honest work, like Dad said." "We did about $340 million in revenue the last full year before I sold," I said. "Give or take." The table did not go silent exactly. Silence would have been too obvious, and these were people trained by money and manners to absorb surprises without showing the seams. But something shifted. A reorientation, slight and collective, the way a room full of people unconsciously adjusts when a door opens and the air pressure changes. Victor looked up from his plate. Ethan's wine glass paused halfway to his mouth. "You sold the company," he said, 12 years ago." I picked up my fork again. I wanted to be done with it. My wife had just passed. I decided what I wanted to do with the time I had left was simpler than running a company. "What did you sell it for?" One of the men asked the associate with the associate's wife in the pearl earrings, his voice carrying the involuntary directness of someone who forgot for a moment to be indirect. "Enough," I said pleasantly. "More than enough." Ethan set his wine glass down. His face had rearranged itself into something that was still a smile, but carried a different quality underneath it. The smile of a man who has just discovered that the furniture he has been sitting on belonged to someone else and always had. "You never mentioned any of this," he said, and this time the remark was addressed to Claire, not to me, with an edge that was small, but present. A blade kept flat so it didn't catch the light. Claire looked at her husband. "You never asked," she said quietly. It was 8 words. 8 ordinary words. But the table heard them, and so did I, and so did Ethan, and for just a moment, the careful architecture of the evening developed a crack too small to see, but large enough to feel underfoot. Victor recovered first, as men like Victor always do, because they have spent their lives in rooms where they were the largest thing, and they know how to reassert that without appearing to try. "Well," he said, lifting his fresh bourbon in a small toast in my direction. Self-made man. Nothing wrong with that. Plenty of people build something and cash out. Smart even. Enjoy the retirement. He said retirement the way you say the word checkered, with a faint implication that whatever came next was a diminishment. I enjoy it fine, I said. I'm sure you do. He drank. Ethan had recovered his conversational footing and was already redirecting, turning to the man on his left to discuss something about municipal permits, his voice back to its regular register the moment metabolized and filed somewhere he would deal with later. But I caught the look he gave Claire before he turned away. It lasted less than a second. A look of assessment, flat and cool, the look of a man revising a calculation he thought he had already finished. It was not an angry look. Anger would have been better. It was the look of a man deciding what this new information meant for him specifically and what adjustments it required. Claire caught it too. I watched her catch it. I watched something move through her chest, a small, involuntary contraction there and gone. I thought about the day I decided to sell the company. I sat in my office on the 14th floor of the building on Asylum Avenue in Hartford. Looking out at the city, I had spent 30 years building something in, and I thought, Margaret is gone, and the work was always for her, and for Claire, and Claire is grown, and the work has become the thing itself, rather than the reason for the thing, and I am 60 years old, and I am going to stop. I signed the papers on a Thursday. The following Monday, I drove to Wethersfield and started cleaning out a garage. Nobody needed to know what the papers said. Nobody needed to know about the 14th floor or the 11 states or the 4 overseas partnerships. I had not told the man Claire dated before Ethan, a quiet accountant from Simsbury, whose name I still remembered, but whose relevance had long since passed. I had not told the neighbors. I had not told the woman at the hardware store on Route 34. I had not told Ethan because Ethan had never asked. And now he knew. I watched him laugh at something the man beside him said, easy and confident, the performance flawless. But his right hand, resting on the table beside his wine glass, had closed slowly into a loose fist, and it stayed that way for a long time. I noted it the way I note things, without comment, without conclusion, waiting for the information to mean something. The third course arrived, and the table reorganized itself around the food the way tables do conversations, breaking into smaller pairs, the general noise level rising just enough to create the comfortable illusion of privacy. Ethan had moved on. His voice was back to its regular cadence, easy and expansive holding court, with the 2 men to his left about a zoning variance in Fairfield County that he described as a significant opportunity, his hands moving in the generous gestures of a man painting a picture he wanted others to buy. I watched Claire. She had barely touched the salmon. She had rearranged it twice, moving it from one side of the plate to the other, with the focused attention of someone performing a task, to avoid having to perform a different one. Her wine glass was full. She had not drunk from it since the first course. Small details, the kind that don't announce themselves, the kind you only notice if you have been watching someone long enough and carefully enough to know what their normal looks like. Her normal used to look like this, seconds on everything, elbows on the table when she forgot herself talking with her hands. When she got excited about something, laughing loudly enough that Margaret used to say it from the next room, that laugh again, as though the laugh were a separate creature living in the house with us. I had not heard Claire laugh like that in 2 years. Diane touched my arm lightly. She's lovely, your daughter. She said quietly enough that it was meant only for me. You must be proud. Every day, I said. Diane looked at Claire for a moment, with the careful eyes of a woman who has noticed something she is not going to say out loud in this company, and then she turned back to her plate. I liked Diane. She was paying attention to the right things and keeping what she saw to herself, which is a form of intelligence that does not get enough credit. Ethan's voice rose slightly at the far end of the table, not in volume but in the particular frequency that meant he was performing rather than speaking. He was telling a story about a contractor who had misread a blueprint, delivering the punchline with the timing of a man who has told it before and knows where the laugh is. The laugh came. Right on schedule. Claire. Ethan's voice carried down the table without effort, sliding into a gap between conversations with the ease of water finding a crack. Tell them about the situation with the kitchen tile, the one where the installer showed up with the wrong order. Several faces turned toward Claire with the polite expectation of an audience that has been cued. Claire looked up from her plate. A small adjustment happened in her expression, a gathering the way a person composes themselves before speaking in a room where the wrong answer has consequences. "It worked out fine," she said. "We got the right order inside a week. She's being modest." Ethan smiled at the table. She had the supplier on the phone inside 10 minutes of the delivery arriving, had a manager involved inside 20, and had a written commitment for expedited replacement before lunch, all while managing 2 other contractors on the same floor. He looked at Claire with an expression that was warm on the surface and proprietary underneath. "She's relentless when she wants to be." "That's impressive," someone said. Claire smiled. "It was just a phone call," she said. "See?" Ethan spread his hands. "Modest." I looked at my daughter's face when Ethan turned back to his conversation. The smile was still there, the correct social smile, durable and practiced. But behind it, something had pulled tight, the way a rope pulls tight when the weight on the other end has increased past what it was designed to hold. She picked up her fork. She moved the salmon again. She set the fork back down. I thought about a Saturday morning when Claire was 12 years old, and she had come downstairs to find me already in the kitchen, making pancakes, and she had stood in the doorway in her pajamas and said, "Dad, how do you know when something is wrong, but you can't explain why? You know." And I had said, "You know the way, you know when a room smells different, not bad exactly, just different from how it usually smells." And she had thought about that for a while. And then she had said, "Okay," and sat down at the table and eaten 4 pancakes. I had thought about that conversation many times over the years. I was thinking about it now. Something in this room smelled different. Had smelled different since I walked in. Not wrong in any single dramatic way, but wrong in the accumulated way of 100 small things that were each individually explainable and collectively not. Ethan said something to Victor, and they both laughed. And Victor reached over and clapped his son on the shoulder, and the gesture had in it the particular satisfaction of 2 men who share a worldview and are pleased to find themselves still sharing it. Claire watched this. Her shoulders moved a barely perceptible inch upward, the involuntary bracing of someone who has learned to read that particular dynamic and knows what sometimes follows it. I set my napkin on the table beside my plate. Under the table, my hand found my phone. I did not take it out. I did not need to yet. But I held it the way you hold something you know you are going to need, with the quiet readiness of a man who has been patient long enough and can feel the end of his patience arriving not as a loss of control, but as a door opening into a different kind of room. Claire reached for her water glass. Her sleeve pulled back. The mark on her wrist caught the candlelight for half a second, reminding me that she had been carrying a pain she never spoke about. I looked at it. I looked at Ethan. I looked back at my daughter's face. She had seen me see it. She did not move her sleeve down. She held my gaze for 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she told me everything she had not said in 4 months of short phone calls and returned birthday cards and 9-minute conversations that ended when a voice came from the background. Then she looked away. And I understood that tonight was not going to end the way Ethan Whitmore expected it to end. Ethan refilled his wine glass without offering to refill anyone else's first, a small thing, the kind of small thing that means nothing in isolation and everything in accumulation. And then he looked down the table at Claire and said pleasantly, "The way you remind someone of a chore they forgot. Honey, you haven't touched your plate. Our guests are going to think you don't like the food." Several faces turned toward Claire with the polite concern of people who have been given permission to notice something. Claire looked at her plate. Then she looked at Ethan. Then she did something I had not seen her do in 2 years. She did not adjust her expression to accommodate his. "I'm not hungry," she said. "You haven't eaten since this morning." His voice stayed light, informational, the voice of a man who wants the table to hear him being reasonable. "You need to eat something, Claire. You know how you get." The phrase landed in the room and stayed there. "You know how you get." 4 words that contained within them an entire architecture of diminishment, the implication that Claire's inner states were weather patterns she could not control, and he had learned to manage that her hunger or lack of it was a symptom of something, that he was the reasonable one and she was the variable. Diane's fork stopped moving. Claire's jaw tightened. A single degree, barely visible. I saw it because I had been watching her jaw for 47 years, and I knew every degree of it. "I said I'm not hungry, Ethan," she said. "Claire." His voice dropped half a register, still pleasant, but with a floor under it, now a boundary being communicated in the frequency below the words. "We have guests. I know we have guests." She set her fork down on the plate with a sound that was not loud, but was precise, the sound of something being placed, rather than dropped. "I have been sitting here with your guests for 3 hours. I have smiled at your guests. I have answered your guests' questions, or I have started to answer them, and then you have finished my answers for me. And I have smiled about that too." Her voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised. It was the voice of a woman who has discovered that quiet can be a different kind of loud. "I am not hungry." That is a complete sentence. It doesn't need to be managed. The table had gone the particular still of people who are pretending very hard not to be listening while listening with every available sense. Victor set his bourbon down slowly. Ethan's face did something complicated in the space of 2 seconds, a rapid internal negotiation between the version of himself he performed for company and whatever lived underneath that performance. The company version won barely. "Sweetheart." He smiled at the table as though sharing a fond exasperation. "She gets like this when she's tired. Claire, why don't you go lie down for a few minutes and—" "I don't want to lie down." Her hands were flat on the table now, both of them pressing lightly against the cloth, as though steadying herself against something only she could feel moving. "I don't want to go to another room. I don't want to come back when I've had a few minutes and be different than I am right now." She looked at her husband across the candlelight and the crystal and the white pine centerpiece and the perfect Christmas tree visible through the doorway, all of it, all the careful architecture of the life he had built around her. "I don't want any of this. I haven't wanted it for a long time. I just didn't know how to say that until right now, sitting here with my father watching me not eat." The room held its breath. Ethan's smile was gone. What was under it was not anger, not yet. It was something colder and more calculating, the expression of a man running a rapid assessment of damage and options. "We are not doing this here," he said quietly. "You said we have guests," Claire said. "So here seems like where we are." Victor made a sound low and deliberate, not quite a word, a clearing of the throat, that in his vocabulary meant enough. He looked at Claire the way a man looks at something that has exceeded the boundaries of its designated space. "Young lady," he said in the tone of a man who has been calling women young lady his entire life as a method of reducing them. "I think perhaps you've had a long evening. Why don't you—" "Victor!" Richard's voice came out of me before I had decided to use it. He stopped. I had not raised my voice. I had not needed to. There is a register that men like me develop over 30 years of rooms where the words matter and the delivery matters more, a frequency that carries not volume but weight. And Victor Whitmore heard the weight and recognized it the way one animal recognizes another animal that is not smaller than it assumed. "Let her finish," I said. The table was completely still. Claire looked at me. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something that had been waiting a long time for enough air to stay lit. She straightened her spine one vertebra at a time, until she was sitting the way she used to sit at our round oak table in Wethersfield, like a person who had a right to the chair she was in. "I'm done," she said simply. Not to the table, to Ethan. "I've been done for a while. I just needed to say it out loud." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I looked back, and I held his gaze with the same stillness I had held it across negotiation tables and boardrooms and deals that lasted 3 days and came down to who blinked first, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided he is finished waiting and has nothing left to prove and nowhere else to be. Ethan was the one who looked away. Ethan stood up. Nobody had asked him to stand up. The dinner was not over. The guests had not moved. The candles were still burning in their holders, and the Christmas tree was still lit in the next room, and the woman in the black uniform was still somewhere in the kitchen. None of the normal signals that precede a man rising from a table were present. He simply stood, and the act of it changed the air in the room the way a change in barometric pressure changes the air before a storm. Not loud, not obvious, but different, and the difference was the kind that the body registers before the mind catches up. Claire felt it. I watched her feel it. Her hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to her lap, and she straightened slightly. The automatic postural adjustment of someone who has learned to make themselves smaller when the pressure in a room changes in a particular direction. "Excuse us," Ethan said to the table pleasantly, the performance still intact, the smile still present, though thinner now stretched at the edges. "Claire and I need a moment." He walked around the table toward her. His movement was controlled and unhurried, the movement of a man who knows the room belongs to him and is simply relocating within it. Diane's hand found her water glass and held it without drinking. Victor watched his son the way a man watches a chess move he has seen before and approves of. "Ethan." My voice came out low and level. "Sit down." He did not sit down. He reached Claire's chair and stood behind it, and he said something to her that I could not hear from my end of the table. Something quiet and downward meant only for her, and whatever it was made the muscles in her neck pull tight in a way I felt across the length of the room. Claire pushed her chair back and stood. I do not know if she stood because she wanted to, or because remaining seated felt more dangerous. I have thought about that question many times since, and I still do not have a clean answer. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. I know because I counted them the way I have counted things my entire professional life, the way you count when the number matters, and you know you will be asked to report it later. Ethan moved toward Claire in a way that made the entire room freeze. In that moment, everyone understood something had gone terribly wrong. There was a sound. A sharp, dense sound, the kind that has weight behind it, the kind that comes when a person meets something solid that does not move. Then a second sound, lower and briefer, the sound of breath leaving a body faster than it intended to. Then the wall. I saw the crack from where I sat. A clean fracture in the drywall 6 inches long at the height of a shoulder, and I looked at it, and I looked at my daughter, and I looked at the distance between where she had been standing and where she was now, and something ignited in my chest, that 31 years of professional patience had never fully extinguished something older than patience, and louder than anything I had felt in a very long time. Claire had slid down the wall and was on one knee, one hand pressed flat against the floor, steadying herself. Her eyes were wide, and her breath was coming in short, shallow pulls, and she was looking at Ethan with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, something beyond fear, the expression of a person who has passed through the door of fear so many times that they have stopped being surprised to find themselves on the other side of it. Ethan straightened his jacket. "Good," said Victor Whitmore from his chair at the right hand of the table in the calm and satisfied voice of a man delivering a verdict he has long considered correct. He lifted his bourbon and nodded once at his son. The words went into the room and stayed there. I have heard many things in my life. I have sat in rooms where terrible things were said by men who believed they had the right to say them. I have kept my face still through all of it, because keeping your face still is a skill, and I had practiced it past the point of being able to stop. But something happened in my chest when Victor said those words, something that had nothing to do with skill or practice or the patience I had spent 67 years cultivating, something that came from a place much older and much simpler than any of that. It was the place where my daughter's name lived. Diane made a sound, small and involuntary, the sound of someone who has just understood something they had hoped not to understand. One of the other guests pushed back from the table. Nobody spoke. Ethan looked at Victor, and something passed between them, the silent language of two men who share a set of beliefs so fundamental they do not need to be stated, only confirmed. I stood up. I did not knock my chair back. I did not raise my voice. I did not do any of the things that the situation might reasonably have produced in a different man. I simply rose from the chair at the far end of the table, the chair I had been assigned, the chair at the peripheral end, the chair of the tolerated obligation, and I walked the length of the dining room with my hands at my sides and my face arranged in the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now implementing it. I reached Claire before Ethan registered that I was moving. I stepped between them, not dramatically, not with any gesture or word. I simply placed my body in the space between my daughter and her husband, the way you place a hand over a flame, not to extinguish it, but to stop it from reaching what it was reaching for. Claire's hand found my arm. Her grip was tight and her fingers were cold, and she was shaking in the small, contained way of someone trying very hard not to shake. I put my hand over hers. "I've got you," I said quietly. "I've got you." Then I looked at Ethan Whitmore over my shoulder, and I said nothing at all because some messages do not require words, and this was one of them. I guided Claire to the hallway with one hand at her back, light enough that she could pull away if she wanted to. She did not pull away. She walked beside me without speaking, her arms crossed over her chest, holding herself together in the specific way of a person who has learned that holding yourself together is something you have to do actively, or it does not happen. Behind us, I heard Victor say something to the table in a tone that suggested normalcy was being restored, that the unpleasantness had been managed, that dinner could resume. I heard the sound of a chair being moved. I heard Ethan's voice, lower than usual, controlled in the way that things are controlled when the controlling requires effort. I did not turn around.
In the hallway, Claire stopped walking. She turned to face me and I saw her clearly for the first time all evening without a table between us, or a room full of people requiring her to perform. Her eyes were dry. That was the thing I
noticed first. She had not cried. Her jaw was set, and her color was high, and her hands were shaking still, that small, contained tremor that had not stopped since the dining room. But her eyes were dry and clear and looking directly at mine. "Dad," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than I expected. Steadier, I think, than she expected. "Are you hurt?" I asked her. She considered the question in a way that told me she was giving it a real answer rather than an automatic one. "My shoulder," she said. "It's not bad." "Okay," I said. "I need you to go to the kitchen and stay there. Not the dining room, the kitchen. The woman who serves the food, tell her you need a glass of water and sit down." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make a phone call." She looked at me for a moment, and something moved through her expression that I could not fully read, something that was partly relief and partly a grief that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged, the grief of a daughter who realizes her father sees what is happening and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Okay," she said. Then, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't—" "Don't," I said, not harshly, just firmly, the way you stop a sentence that is going to take someone somewhere they don't need to go right now. "We'll talk later. Kitchen, go." She went. I watched her push through the door at the end of the hallway, and then I turned and walked to the front door and opened it and stepped outside into the December cold. The air hit me like a correction. Sharp and clean and real in a way that the inside of that house had not been real all evening. The fairy lights in the birch trees were still on, winding up the white bark in gentle spirals, and the snow was falling lightly, the kind of snow that drifts more than falls, taking its time in no particular hurry to reach the ground. I stood on the front step for a moment. Just a moment. Then I took out my phone and called Daniel Brooks. He picked up on the first ring. "Richard." His voice was alert. Daniel had been running operations for over 2 decades, and he had the particular quality of a man who does not require context to understand that context has changed. "Talk to me. I need you here," I said. 47 Ashbrook Lane, Glastonbury. "Do you know it?" "I can find it in 12 minutes. I need more than just you, Daniel." A pause. Brief. "How much more?" I looked at the crack in the drywall that I could still see through the dining room window from where I stood, the 6-inch fracture at shoulder height that was going to require more than spackle and paint to address. I thought about Claire's shoulder. I thought about Victor Whitmore's voice delivering his verdict from his chair, calm and satisfied, the voice of a man who has said that kind of thing before and never once been told he was wrong. "Enough," I said. "Bring enough that it means something when they see it." Daniel was quiet for 3 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the register I recognized from 30 years ago, the register of a man who has been given a real problem and is already solving it. "Sarah Mitchell is in Hartford tonight. I can have her there." "Good. I need her." "Robert Hayes is with me. He's been looking at something anyway. Something you're going to want to hear about. Bring him. Richard." A pause. "Is Claire all right?" I looked back at the front door of the house. Through the tall windows, I could see the edge of the dining room, the candles still burning, the guests still seated, the performance of normalcy still in progress. Somewhere beyond the hallway and the kitchen, my daughter was sitting with a glass of water and a shaking that had not stopped. "She will be," I said. 12 minutes, Daniel said. "Keep your phone on." "Always do." I ended the call and stood in the snow for another minute. Not because I needed the time, because the cold was honest in a way I needed, before going back inside, before sitting back down at the end of that table and waiting. And the waiting was the part that required the most of me, more than the phone call, more than the walk down the length of the dining room, more than any of it. I had spent 31 years learning that the most dangerous thing a man can do is act before the moment is ready. That the difference between effective and reckless is almost always patience. That the men who won the rooms I worked in were not the loudest or the largest. They were the ones who understood that timing is everything and could hold themselves still until the timing arrived. The timing was 15 minutes away. I put my phone in my pocket. I brushed the snow off my shoulders. I went back inside, walked down the hallway past the kitchen door, and took my seat at the far end of the table. Ethan looked at me. I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink and set it back down and looked at nothing in particular, the way a man looks when he has nowhere he needs to be and nothing he needs to prove. Ethan looked away first. Again. I counted the minutes. I know the exact time because I checked my watch when I sat back down the old Hamilton my father gave me the year I started the company. The one with the crack in the crystal that I have never replaced, because replacing it seemed like a kind of forgetting. 7:52. I know the exact time because I checked my watch when I sat back down the old Hamilton my father gave me the year I started the company. The one with the crack in the crystal that I have never replaced, because replacing it seemed like a kind of forgetting. 7:52. 15 minutes from when Daniel said 15 minutes. Ethan had resumed his position at the head of the table with the practiced ease of a man who has learned that the fastest way to make an incident disappear is to behave as though it already has. He was talking about a ski trip to Vermont that he and Claire were planning for February, his voice carrying the warm enthusiasm of someone describing a future he had already purchased and arranged and expected to enjoy on his own terms. Claire had not returned from the kitchen. Nobody mentioned it. That was the thing that sat in me like a stone as I looked around that table. 10 people educated and well-dressed and possessed of the ordinary moral equipment that most people carry, and not one of them had said a word. Not to Ethan, not to Victor, not to me. They had reorganized themselves around what happened the way water reorganizes around an obstacle smoothly and without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have required something from them that was easier not to give. Diane was the exception. She was not talking. She sat with her hands in her lap and her food untouched and her eyes moving between Ethan and the hallway door with the careful attention of a woman making a decision about something. I respected that. I did not speak to her, but I respected it. 7:56. Ethan was describing the ski lodge, the amenities, the mountain view from the master suite. Victor interjected twice with comparisons to a place in Aspen he preferred, and Ethan deferred to his father with the specific deference of a man who has never fully stopped performing for a particular audience. The guests laughed at the right moments. Wine was poured. The woman in the black uniform appeared from the kitchen and began clearing the third course, moving around the table with the efficient invisibility of someone who has learned to be present without being seen. I watched her come through the kitchen door. Through the brief gap before it swung shut, I saw Claire. She was seated on a stool near the counter with a glass of water held in both hands, the way you hold something when you need something to hold. Her head was down. The tremor in her hands had lessened. She was breathing deliberately, the careful, measured breathing of a person using it as an anchor. The door swung shut. 7:58. Victor said something about the Aspen trip, and one of the men laughed too loudly, the laugh of someone buying time in a conversation they want to end. Ethan's eyes moved to the hallway door and back, a quick, involuntary check, and I noted it the way I note things. He was monitoring for Claire's return, not out of concern, out of management. He wanted her back at the table before the evening concluded, so that the conclusion looked normal, so that the guests left with a particular impression, so that the story of tonight, if there was a story, would be the one he had composed. He did not know there was already a different story in progress. 8:01. The conversation had moved to holiday travel plans, the comfortable neutral territory that dinner parties retreat to when the available subjects have become dangerous. Someone was flying to Phoenix. Someone else had family in Charlotte. Victor was going to Aspen as previously established at length. My phone vibrated once in my jacket pocket. A single vibration. The signal Daniel and I had agreed on 30 years ago when we were coordinating operations across 11 states and needed a check-in protocol that worked in rooms where you could not take a call. One vibration meant in position. 2 meant delay. 3 meant abort. 1 vibration. In position. 8:04. I picked up my water glass and drank and set it down and looked at the crack in the dining room wall. Ethan had positioned himself so that his back was to it. Victor had not looked at it once since it happened. The crack was 6 inches long, and it ran diagonally through the drywall at shoulder height, and it was the most honest thing in the room. Diane caught me looking at it. Our eyes met for a moment, and she looked away quickly, but not before I saw in her face the particular expression of a person who has been trying to talk themselves out of what they know and has just given up trying. 8:06. Ethan was mid-sentence about the Vermont Lodge's proximity to a particular trail system when the sound reached us. It was subtle at first. A low collective sound, the sound of engines, multiple engines running in close formation. The particular acoustic signature of high-displacement motors at idle. The kind of sound you feel in your sternum before you consciously register it in your ears. One of the guests paused mid-conversation, then another. Then the windows began to lighten, not all at once. Gradually the way dawn comes, except from the wrong direction, and in the wrong color, white and precise and multiplying headlights sweeping across the birch trees and the snow and the stone facade of the house. In slow, deliberate sequence, one set after another, until the dining room windows glowed with reflected light that had no business being there at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening in December. Ethan stopped talking. Victor turned in his chair toward the window. The sound of the engines had reached a quiet, collective purr, the sound of things that have arrived and are not leaving, and in the sudden stillness of the dining room, with 10 people turning toward the windows, and the light pouring in from outside. I set my water glass down on the table for the last time and folded my hands in front of me. 15 minutes. Daniel was always exactly on time. Before I reveal what happens next, when those 12 engines stop in the driveway, type "still here" in the comments right now. So I know you're tuned in to the dynamic, and a quick reminder. The upcoming section includes dramatic, fictionalized elements for entertainment purposes. If that's not your style, feel free to pause or step away here. Victor Whitmore stood up. In the 3 hours I had been in that house, I had not seen Victor Whitmore stand up for anything. He had remained in his chair at the right hand of the table with the settled authority of a man who believes that the world is correctly organized when it comes to him. Watching him rise, now turning toward the window with his bourbon still in his hand and his face arranged in an expression I had not seen on it before, something between confusion and the first early signs of alarm. I understood that the vehicles in the driveway were already doing their first work before a single door had opened. There were 12 of them. I knew because I had asked for 12, and Daniel Brooks had never, in 28 years of working together, delivered anything other than exactly what was asked for. They were black, all of them. Rolls-Royce Phantoms, and they had arranged themselves in the curved driveway with a precision that suggested choreography, their headlights illuminating the birch trees and the snow and the stone face of the house in a wash of white light that turned the fairy lights dim by comparison. The engines cut simultaneously. That was the detail that did it. Not the vehicles themselves, not the number of them, but the silence that followed when 12 engines stopped at the exact same moment. A silence that was somehow louder than the sound had been a silence with mass and intention behind it. One of the guests said quietly, "What is that?" Nobody answered. Ethan was already moving toward the front door. I rose from my chair at the far end of the table and followed him, and I heard other guests pushing back their chairs behind me. The collective movement of people drawn toward a thing they do not yet understand. Ethan pulled open the front door. The cold came in immediately sharp and clean, and with it the sound of feet on the stone driveway, measured and unhurried, the sound of people who are walking towards something they have decided to walk toward, and are not uncertain about it. Daniel Brooks was the first one I saw. He was 60 years old, and he had the build of a man who had spent 3 decades moving things, and the bearing of a man who had spent the same 3 decades deciding where they went. He was wearing a dark overcoat and no tie, which was Daniel's way of saying, "This is serious, but I am not performing seriousness for you." Behind him, Sarah Mitchell walked with a leather document case under her arm, small and precise in her movements. The kind of woman who takes up exactly the space she needs, and not 1 inch more. Behind her, Robert Hayes, broad-shouldered and deliberate, carrying nothing in his hands, which meant whatever he had brought was in his head, and had been for some time. Behind the 3 of them, 9 more people fanned out across the driveway in a loose formation, standing in the snow, with their hands at their sides, present and still and saying nothing. Former colleagues. People whose companies I had helped restructure in bad years. A man I had lent money to in 2001 when the economy went sideways and the banks would not. A woman whose transportation contract I had guaranteed with my own signature when nobody else would guarantee it. They had come because I called, not because I asked them to come. I had not asked. I had called Daniel, and Daniel had made 3 other calls, and those people had made calls. And 12 hours later, 12 cars were in Ethan Whitmore's driveway at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening in December. Because that is what 30 years of doing things the right way looks like when it finally needs to look like something. Daniel reached the front step. He looked at Ethan with the polite, calibrated attention of a man assessing a situation he has already assessed, and then he looked past Ethan at me, and he nodded once. "Richard," he said. "Daniel," I said. Ethan's head moved between us. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was costing him something now. "What is this? This is private property. You can't just—" "My name is Daniel Brooks," Daniel said pleasantly. "I'm the chairman of Brooks Consolidated Group. We have 11 subsidiary companies operating across the northeastern United States and 2 international partnerships. Richard Callaway built the foundation that became those companies. He sold them to me 12 years ago for a price I have never publicly disclosed, because he asked me not to, and I respected that, because that is the kind of man he is." He paused. "And you are Ethan Whitmore. We need to talk about your company." The color left Ethan's face in a way that was almost clinical to watch, draining from the surface the way water drains from a basin, steadily and completely. Victor appeared in the doorway behind his son. He looked at the 12 cars. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the people arranged across his son's driveway, standing in the snow without expression. And I watched something happen in his face that I had not seen there all evening. He recognized it. Not the people, not the cars, but the thing behind them. The particular quality of organized and patient power that does not need to announce itself, because it does not need to, because announcement is for people who are uncertain whether they will be heard, and these people were not uncertain. Victor Whitmore had spent 65 years being the largest thing in every room he entered. He was looking at people who had never heard of him. I stepped forward past Ethan and stood on the front step beside Daniel, and I looked back into the house through the entryway and down the hallway toward the kitchen door, and I said loud enough to carry, "Claire, come out here, please." A pause. Then the kitchen door opened. My daughter walked down the hallway toward the front door, her arms at her sides, her chin level, her eyes finding mine as she came, and I watched her cross the threshold and step out into the cold December night and stand beside me, and I felt her straighten as she took in what was in the driveway, the light and the stillness, and the people who had come because her father had asked. She looked up at me. "Dad," she said quietly. "Who are all these people?" "The people who owe me nothing," I said, and came anyway. "That's the only kind worth having." We moved inside because the cold was real, even if everything else about the evening had stopped being. Daniel came in first, then Sarah, then Robert, and the three of them filled the entryway with a kind of quiet that was different from the quiet that had been in the house before. The way the air in a room changes when the windows have been opened for the first time in a long season. The remaining guests had gathered near the living room doorway, uncertain whether to stay or leave, doing what people do in uncertain situations, which is nothing, while they waited for someone to tell them what the situation was. Ethan positioned himself in the center of the entryway, with his arms at his sides and his jaw set the posture of a man who has decided that occupying space is the same as controlling it. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said to Daniel, "but I want to be very clear that whatever this is, it ends here, in my house, on my terms." Daniel looked at him with the patient attention of a man who has heard that particular sentence or sentences, very much like it more times than he can count, and has never once found it persuasive. "Of course," Daniel said. "Why don't we sit down?" He said it the way you say it when sitting down is not actually a question. We moved into the living room. Victor took the armchair nearest the fireplace, the seat of maximum authority in the room, and I noted that his bourbon was gone, and he had not refilled it, which told me something about where his attention was. Claire sat on the sofa beside me, close enough that her arm pressed lightly against mine, and I felt her breathing slow and deliberate, the same anchor, breathing she had been doing in the kitchen. Ethan remained standing. "Ethan," Daniel said pleasantly, "please sit down. What I have to say is going to take a few minutes, and it will be easier for everyone if you're not standing over us while I say it." Something moved in Ethan's face. He sat. Daniel remained standing himself, which was not accidental. He stood in the center of the room with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at Ethan with the level, untroubled gaze of a man about to explain something that he finds neither dramatic nor complicated, simply true. "Richard Callaway started Callaway Logistics in 1989, Daniel said. He was 32 years old. He had $14,000, a used truck, and a commercial driver's license. By 2003, Callaway Logistics operated in 11 states, employed 412 people, and had gross annual revenue of $340 million. In 2007, he also partnered with 3 freight operators in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany, the first American regional logistics company of its size to do so profitably. The room was very quiet. In 2013, Daniel continued, "Richard sold the company to a holding group that I structured and largely financed. The sale price was not publicly disclosed. I can tell you that it was the largest private logistics transaction in Connecticut state history at that time. I can also tell you that Richard negotiated the sale in a way that protected all 412 of his employees for a minimum of 3 years post-acquisition. He did not have to do that. He did it anyway. Victor had gone very still in the armchair. Ethan was looking at me. He was looking at the charcoal jacket and the ordinary shoes and the face of a man who had driven to his house in a 14-year-old Buick. And I could see him doing the mathematics of it, the painful arithmetic of a man recalculating an assumption he had built an entire evening's worth of behavior on top of. After the sale, Daniel said Richard's wife Margaret passed away. He moved to Wethersfield. He fixed things in his garage. He shopped on Tuesdays. He drove the same car he had driven for 6 years because he liked the car and had no interest in replacing something that still worked. Daniel paused. The people outside tonight came because Richard asked, not because he called in favors. Richard does not operate in favors. He operates in relationships which are different because relationships are built over time and maintained through character and do not expire. Most of the people in that driveway have known Richard for over 20 years, some of them for 30. They came tonight because when Richard Calloway asks you to be somewhere, the reason he is asking is sufficient. Ethan's throat moved. "I don't understand," he said, and his voice had lost something, the particular confidence that had carried it all evening, the frequency of a man who believes the room belongs to him. "Why didn't you ever say any of this?" He was asking me. I looked at my son-in-law across the living room of the house he had built, with money he did not have, surrounded by people he had spent the evening trying to impress. And I thought about 31 years of rooms where what you didn't say mattered more than what you did, and I said the only thing that was true. "You never asked about me," I said. "You asked about what I drove and what I did and what I was worth to your dinner conversation. Those are different questions. Nobody who actually wanted to know me asked those questions. The people who wanted to know me just showed up and paid attention." I looked at Claire when I said it. She was looking back at me, and her eyes were bright, and her jaw was steady, and she reached over and put her hand on top of mine, on the cushion between us, and I turned my hand over and held hers and felt her grip tighten, not the cold, trembling grip from the dining room, but something warmer and more deliberate, the grip of a person who has found the ground under their feet again and is testing whether it will hold. It would hold. Sarah Mitchell opened her document case. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, looking at Ethan with the calm precision of a woman who has spent 23 years in family and financial law and has never once confused being polite with being gentle. "I think it's time we talked about Whitmore Construction Group." Sarah Mitchell did not open the folder dramatically. She did not spread documents across the coffee table or hold anything up for the room to see. She simply set the document case on her knee, opened it, removed a single bound report, and placed it on the cushion beside her with the unhurried precision of a woman who has never needed theater to make a point. "Whitmore Construction Group," she said, "has filed audited financial statements with its lenders showing consistent revenue growth over the past 4 fiscal years. 31 million in year 1, 38 in year 2, 44 in year 3, 51 projected for the current year." She paused. Robert Hayes leaned forward from the chair where he had been sitting in silence since they came inside. He was a large man who moved with the careful economy of someone who has learned that deliberate stillness communicates more than agitation. He set a second report on the table beside Sarah's. "The actual numbers," he said, "are different. I've spent the past 6 weeks looking at Whitmore Construction's real financial position. Bank draws, contractor invoices, materials, receipts, payroll records. Not the statements filed with lenders. The underlying transactions." He looked at Ethan. "The company has not been profitable in 3 years. Current liabilities exceed assets by approximately $1.8 million. 2 active construction projects were halted in the past 8 months due to unpaid subcontractor invoices. The Millbrook project, which was rebranded in the spring, was halted because the primary lender called the note after discovering discrepancies between reported and actual project completion percentages. The room processed this in silence. Ethan's hands were on his knees. His face had the quality of a man listening to a diagnosis he has been avoiding for a long time and can no longer avoid. "Those are preliminary figures," he said. His voice was even careful. "You're looking at a snapshot without context. Construction cash flow is cyclical. Any competent analyst would tell you." "I am a competent analyst," Robert said without heat, without hurry. "I spent 19 years as a senior examiner with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation before I went private. I have looked at the books of over 300 construction companies in that time. I know what cyclical cash flow looks like, and I know what insolvency looks like, and I know the difference between the two." Ethan said nothing. Sarah continued. "In the past 22 months, Whitmore Construction Group has drawn against a home equity line of credit secured by the marital residence. The total draws against that line amount to $430,000. The marital residence is jointly owned by Ethan and Claire Whitmore." She looked at Claire directly for the first time. "Claire, were you informed of these draws? Did you authorize them?" Claire's grip on my hand tightened. "No," she said. "I didn't know about any line of credit." "That's what I expected," Sarah said, not unkindly. "Under Connecticut law, both spouses must consent in writing to encumber a jointly owned marital residence. The signature on the consent documents is yours, Claire. Our handwriting analysis indicates it is not consistent with your actual signature on file." She let that land before she continued. "Additionally, Claire's personal inheritance from her mother's estate held in an account in her name was used as collateral for a commercial loan taken out by Whitmore Construction in March of last year. The collateral pledge was executed without Claire's knowledge or consent. The word forgery had not been used. It did not need to be. It was in the room the same way the crack in the dining room wall was still in the house, present and specific, and requiring no announcement." Victor cleared his throat. "These are serious allegations," he said, his voice carrying the graveled authority of a man accustomed to having that voice resolve things. "I would strongly suggest that nobody say anything further without legal counsel present." "That's sensible advice," Sarah said pleasantly. "You should take it yourself, Mr. Whitmore. Specifically regarding the commercial loan from Northeastern Capital Partners, executed in February of this year, on which you appear as a co-signatory." She turned a page in her report. "Under federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. 1343, submitting materially false financial statements to obtain commercial financing constitutes wire fraud. The applications for both loans contained the fabricated figures Robert just described. You signed one of those applications, Mr. Whitmore. That does not make you a witness to what happened. That makes you a participant." Victor's face did something I had not seen it do all evening. It went uncertain. Not afraid, not yet. Victor Whitmore was not a man who moved quickly to fear, but uncertain, which in a man like him was its own species of damage, the first fracture in a foundation that had never expected to be tested from below. "I want to be clear about something," I said. Everyone looked at me. I had not spoken in some time, and the room had perhaps forgotten I was capable of it. "I did not bring these people here to threaten anyone," I said. "I brought them here because my daughter has been living inside a set of circumstances she did not fully understand, and she deserved to understand them. What Sarah and Robert have described are matters that will now follow their own course through the appropriate institutions. I did not design that course. I did not accelerate it. The numbers Robert found are the numbers that existed before tonight. The signatures Sarah identified were forged before tonight. I made 2 phone calls. Everything else was already true. I looked at Ethan. The difference between what I did and what you did, I said, is that what I did required the truth to already exist. What you did required it not to. Ethan's jaw worked. His mouth opened and then closed. Across the room, Claire picked up the bound report from the cushion beside Sarah and held it in both hands and began to read, and the room went quiet around her, and nobody spoke. And we waited for my daughter to finish reading the truth about the life she had been living. Nobody spoke while Claire read. That was the thing I will remember longest about that room. Not the documents or the numbers or the look on Ethan's face, but the quality of the silence while my daughter sat on that sofa and read every page of the report in her hands. It was not the silence of people being polite. It was the silence of people who understood that something was happening, that did not belong to them, that the only person in the room whose next word mattered was the one who was not yet speaking. She read slowly. She turned each page with deliberate care, the way she used to read as a child, her finger moving slightly along the lines, her face still and concentrated. I had forgotten she read that way. It came back to me now the way small, true things come back when you stop moving fast enough to notice them. When she finished, she set the report on the cushion beside her. She did not slam it down. She did not throw it. She placed it with the same quiet precision that Sarah had used when she first produced it, and I understood that something had transferred between those 2 actions, that Claire had absorbed something from the document beyond its contents. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she looked at Ethan. He was watching her from the chair across the room with the careful attention of a man who has run out of moves and is waiting to see what the board looks like before he decides whether to concede or to tip it over. His jaw was set. His hands were folded. The performance of composure was still there, but it had gone thin, the way ice goes thin in late February, still present, still covering the surface, but no longer something you would trust to hold your weight. "Did you forge my signature?" Claire asked. The question was simple and direct, and she asked it the way you ask a question when you already know the answer, but need to hear it spoken in the room. Ethan said nothing. "Did you take money from the account my mother left me?" Claire said, and her voice did not rise, it did not shake. It moved through the room with a level steadiness that cost her something I could see in the set of her shoulders, in the deliberate way she was holding the muscles of her face. Without telling me, without asking me, Ethan looked at the floor. In 31 years of rooms where answers were owed and not given, I learned that a man who looks at the floor when a direct question has been asked has answered it. The floor is the answer. The silence is the answer. Claire nodded slowly, once, the nod of a person completing a calculation. She stood up, not dramatically, not with tears, not with the particular performance of a woman in a crisis that television and movies have trained us to expect. She stood up the way a person stands up when they have been sitting too long, and their body has finally decided it is finished sitting. Simple. Deliberate. Final. She looked at me. I stood up beside her. "Dad," she said quietly. "I want to leave," I nodded. I reached into my jacket pocket, and I took out the small, folded piece of paper I had written on while I stood in the snow outside an hour ago, the one I had torn from the notepad I keep in my car, out of a 30-year habit of always having something to write on. I held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it and read it. It said, "You do not have to decide anything tonight except whether to walk out this door. Everything else can wait. I have you." Her throat moved. She folded the paper back along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her dress and squared her shoulders and looked at Ethan one more time. "I'm going with my father tonight," she said. "I'll be in touch with you through Sarah." Claire. Ethan's voice cracked open on her name, the composure finally giving way, and what came through was something that might have been genuine, the sound of a man who has broken something and is only now understanding the full weight of what it was. "Please, we can talk about this. You don't have to." "I do," she said, simply, without anger, without performance, without the need to explain it further. 2 words that had the weight of 2 years behind them. She turned toward the door. I walked beside her. Daniel stepped back to let us pass. Sarah fell in quietly behind us. At the entryway, Claire paused and lifted her coat from the hook on the wall, the coat she had hung there when she arrived at her own home, and she put it on herself without help, without hurry, buttoning each button from the bottom up. I heard Victor say something behind us. I did not turn around. Ethan said her name once more from the living room, softer this time, less certain of itself. Claire opened the front door. The cold air came in again, the same honest December cold that had hit me when I stood on this step an hour ago, and Claire walked out into it without hesitating, and I followed her, and behind us the door swung shut on the warmth and the candles and the perfect Christmas tree and everything that had been built in that house to look like something it was not. The 12 cars were still there. The people standing beside them straightened as we came out, a small collective adjustment, the simple acknowledgement of people who have been waiting and understand that the waiting is over. Sarah came to stand beside us on the front step. "I'll have an emergency protective order filed before midnight," she said quietly. "That's a court order requiring Ethan to vacate the marital residence within a specified period while the legal proceedings are initiated. He will not be able to ask you to leave your own home, Claire. That home belongs to both of you until a court determines otherwise, and he will be the one to go." Claire listened to this carefully. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. Sarah touched her arm briefly and went to make a call. I looked at my daughter, standing in the snow in front of 12 black cars on a Friday night. In December, her coat buttoned all the way up her breath, making small clouds in the cold air, and she looked like herself in a way she had not looked all evening, in a way she had perhaps not looked in a very long time. "Ready?" I said. "Yes," she said. We walked to my car. The Buick smelled like motor oil and the pine air freshener I had hanging from the mirror since October, and when Claire got in and closed the door, she sat for a moment, just breathing it in her hands in her lap, her eyes straight ahead. And I thought she was going to cry, finally, now that there was no room to perform for and no one to hold herself together in front of. She did not cry. She let out a long breath, slow, and controlled the last of the anchor breathing, and then she turned and looked at the dashboard and said, "Dad, this car is really old." I started the engine. "It runs. The heater works. Give it a minute." She pulled her coat tighter and looked out the window as I backed out of the driveway past the last 2 Rolls-Royces still parked along the curve, their black flanks catching the fairy lights from the birch trees one final time. The house receded in the rearview mirror, all its lit windows and stone facades smaller and smaller until the bend in the road took it. I did not watch it go. I had seen enough of it. Neither of us spoke for the first several minutes. The heater found its footing gradually, the way the old Buick always did, working up to warmth rather than arriving at it, which had always seemed to me an honest way to operate. Some things should not pretend to be warm before they are. The road was quiet, the suburban streets giving way to the darker county roads that I preferred on the way back. Less traffic, more sky, the kind of road where you can hear yourself think, if you have something worth thinking about. Claire was the one who broke it. How long have you known? She asked. Her voice was even curious rather than accusatory, the voice of someone asking a question they genuinely want the answer to, rather than a question they want to weaponize. Known what specifically, I said. That something was wrong. I thought about that carefully, the way it deserved to be thought about. I wanted to give her a real answer, rather than a reassuring one, because she had just spent several hours in a room where she was given reassuring answers that were not real, and she deserved the other kind. The honest kind. Even when the honest kind is harder to receive. The first time you called me from his number instead of yours, I said. About 14 months ago. You said your phone was charging. I believed you then. I stopped believing it around the third time. She absorbed this quietly. I didn't think you noticed things like that. I notice everything, I said. I just don't always say so. She turned to look at me in the dark of the car, this daughter of mine, 34 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of a 14-year-old Buick, with her coat buttoned up and her hands in her lap, her face in the passing light of the street lamps coming and going in slow rhythm. And I could feel her deciding something, the way you can feel a door deciding whether it is going to open, the particular weight of a person arriving at the edge of a thing they have been circling for a long time. I kept thinking I could fix it, she said. That if I was better at being what he needed, it would get better. That the version of our life he put on the internet was real, and I just wasn't trying hard enough to live inside it. I know, I said. I gave up my job, Dad. I know. Honey, I gave up my clients. People who trusted me. People I had spent 3 years building relationships with the same way you told me to, one at a time, slowly doing the work right. Her voice tightened slightly on this, the specific grief of a person who followed the right principles in the wrong direction. I gave up the office I rented on Charter Oak Avenue, the one with the big windows that faced east, so I had good light all morning. Her voice caught on that detail, the windows and the morning light, the specific texture of a thing surrendered, that you cannot get back in the same form, only in new forms that take time to find. I thought it was a choice. I thought I was choosing. I drove for a moment without speaking. The headlights picking out the road ahead in the particular yellow-white of old halogens that I had also never replaced, because they worked fine, and I had never seen the point of replacing things that worked fine. Some men upgrade for the sake of upgrading. I never understood that. Your mother used to say, I said, that the most dangerous thing a person can do to you is convince you that their idea was yours. Claire was quiet, listening. She said it about a contractor we hired once who talked me into a design I didn't want for the back porch, I said. But she meant it generally. She meant it about all the ways a person can be redirected from themselves so gradually that they don't notice the distance until they turn around and can't see where they started. A small sound came from the passenger seat. It took me a moment to recognize it because I had not heard it in 2 years. It was a laugh. Small and short and surprised out of her, the kind of laugh that arrives before you have decided to let it, the kind that is more honest than the kind you choose. A contractor, she said. He wanted a railing I thought was ugly. I ended up agreeing with him somehow. I still don't know exactly how it happened. Margaret never let me forget it. Was the railing ugly, extremely, dark green iron, completely wrong for the house? Is it still there? I painted it white 3 months after she passed, I said. Took me 4 hours. It was the first thing I changed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed again. Longer this time, not at the railing exactly, but at something underneath it. The small absurdity of men and their stubbornness and the women who outlast it. And it was the laugh I remembered, the one that used to come from the next room when she was on the phone with her friends, or watching something funny on television. The laugh that Margaret used to narrate from the kitchen, that laugh again, as though the laugh were a creature living in the house that belonged to all of us. It filled the old car and went up against the windows, and I kept my eyes on the road, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would improve on the sound of it. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Sarah Mitchell. I handed it to Claire without looking. She read the message, and her laughter settled into something quieter, but not sadder, the way a fire settles when the initial kindling burns down and becomes something steadier. EPO granted, she said. He has until 8 a.m. tomorrow to leave. Good, I said. She set the phone back in the cup holder and looked out the window at the sky that had opened up now that we were on the county road. The clouds thinning enough to show a scattering of stars, and the pale, curved edge of a half-moon sitting low over the tree line. Dad, she said. Yeah. Those people tonight, in the cars. She paused, organizing the thought. You really helped all of them, all 12. It over time, I said. Nothing dramatic. You show up when someone needs you to show up. You put your name on things when your name means something. You answer the phone at inconvenient hours. You write the check when the check is the right thing to write. I considered it. It accumulates. You don't notice it accumulating. And then one December night you make one phone call and 12 people get in their cars. She thought about that for a while. Her head turned slightly toward the window, the half-moon keeping pace with us through the tree line. I want to do that, she said finally. I want to be someone who accumulates things like that. Relationships that show up. People who come when you call because of who you are, not what you have. You will, I said. You already started. You just couldn't see it from inside that house. She leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes for a moment, and the tension I had been watching in her shoulders and her jaw and her hands all evening finally gradually released the way a fist releases when there is nothing left that requires holding. Through the windshield, the first familiar landmarks of Wethersfield were beginning to appear, the water tower catching the moonlight, the white church steeple above the dark tree line, the warm, scattered lights of Route 34 in the distance telling me we were almost home. Dad, she said almost to herself, her eyes still closed. You have 12 Rolls-Royces worth of friends, and you drive this car. The Buick works, I said. It really is ugly, though. It is, I agreed. Completely. She smiled without opening her eyes. She was still smiling when we pulled into Birchwood Lane, and the porch light was on the way. I always leave it when I go out at night, because a house should look like it expects you back, and this one did, and we were. The morning after, I made coffee at 6 and sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence of a house that has a person sleeping in the guest room for the first time in 4 years, which is a different silence than the silence of an empty house, heavier and warmer at the same time. Claire slept until 9:30. I knew because I heard the exact moment she stopped the small sounds of a person coming back to themselves in an unfamiliar room. The creak of the guest bed water running in the hallway bathroom. The particular quiet of someone standing at a window before they are ready to face the day. I poured a second cup and left it on the counter where she would find it, and I went out to the garage and started working on the carburetor I had abandoned 3 days ago. And at 9:52 she appeared in the garage doorway in Margaret's old cardigan that she must have found in the closet, holding the coffee with both hands. Her hair not yet arranged. Her eyes clear. Sarah called, she said. I heard the phone. Ethan left the house at 7:40. EPO is in effect. She looked at the carburetor on the workbench. What are you doing? Fixing something, I said. She nodded as though this were a sufficient answer, because in this house it always had been, and she pulled a stool to the edge of the workbench and sat down and drank her coffee and watched me work. And we did not need to say anything else about the night before, not yet, because some things need a little distance before they become words. What followed in the next 9 months was not dramatic in the way that the night itself had been dramatic. It was the quieter, more grinding work of institutions, doing what institutions are built to do when given sufficient evidence and sufficient reason. January brought the EPO hearing. Ethan's attorney argued that the order was disproportionate and requested modification. The judge reviewed Sarah's documentation, the forged signature analysis, the unauthorized collateral pledge the home equity draws, and the medical report from Hartford Hospital documenting Claire's shoulder injury from the night of December 20th, and denied the modification in 11 minutes. Ethan was required to maintain distance from the marital residence and from Claire. He complied, which surprised me less than it might have, because men who exercise control through subtlety rarely have the appetite for confrontation when the subtlety has been stripped away. February brought the formal referral. Sarah filed with the Connecticut State's Attorney's Office. Robert Hayes submitted his financial analysis to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, citing potential violations of 18 U.S.C. 1343. The federal angle complicated things for Ethan significantly, because state charges can sometimes be managed by attorneys with the right local relationships. But federal charges have a different weight to them, a different ceiling, and Ethan's attorneys knew it. March brought the divorce proceedings. Claire had moved back into the marital residence after the EPO cleared the way, which was her right, and she had chosen to exercise it. Because as she told me on the phone from the kitchen of that house, it stopped being his house the night she walked out the front door and started being hers again the moment she walked back in. The divorce was not uncontested. Ethan's attorneys filed counter motions and requested depositions, and did the things that attorneys do when they are billing by the hour and their client cannot accept the arithmetic of his situation. It cost him more than it needed to. It cost him time he did not have. April brought the subcontractors. 11 of them, from 3 different Whitmore construction projects, filed civil suits for unpaid work, totaling $840,000. The suits were not coordinated. They simply arrived one after another, each one representing a small business owner who had done work in good faith and had not been paid and had finally run out of patience. Victor Whitmore's name appeared in 2 of the filings as a personal guarantor on project contracts, which meant his own exposure was no longer theoretical. I received a call from Victor in May. He asked if we could speak privately. I said I did not see the purpose of that conversation. He said he wanted to explain himself. I said that what he had said at the dinner table on the 20th of December had explained him thoroughly. He said he had a family too. I said I knew, and that his family was one of the reasons the conversation he was asking for was not going to happen. He did not call again. June brought the business closure. Whitmore Construction Group filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection, which is the variety that involves liquidation rather than reorganization, which means there was nothing left to reorganize. 41 employees lost their positions. I read about it in the Hartford Courant on a Thursday morning over coffee, and I felt the thing I have always felt when a foreseeable outcome finally arrives. Not satisfaction exactly, and certainly not pleasure, but the specific tired relief of a leak that has been dripping for a long time finally stopping. September brought the resolution. Ethan accepted a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. Wire fraud 1 count in connection with the false financial statements submitted to Northeastern Capital Partners. The agreement carried a sentence of 3 years with a supervised release period following completion. His attorney had negotiated it down from an exposure that Robert told me on a Tuesday evening phone call had originally been considerably higher. Victor entered a separate agreement on the guarantor fraud charges, receiving a substantial fine and 2 years of probation, which was a lighter outcome than he deserved, and a heavier one than he had believed possible as recently as January. October brought the divorce decree. Claire received the marital residence, her inheritance account restored in full with interest, and a structured settlement that Sarah described on the phone as appropriate given the circumstances, which in legal language means that the other party did not fare well. Claire did not seem interested in the settlement. She had already accepted a design contract with a hotel group in Hartford, 2 properties, the same kind of opportunity she had been offered 4 years ago before she put down her work to become someone's idea of a wife. She called me when she signed the contract. She said, "Dad, I have big windows again." I was in the garage when she called. I put down what I was doing and I sat on the old stool and I held the phone and I listened to my daughter tell me about her windows. And I thought about Margaret. And I thought about 31 years of work and one December night and the particular arithmetic of things that are lost and things that are found. And I did not say much because there was not much to say, only, "Good," I said. "That's good, Claire." That evening she came over for dinner, and she brought groceries, and she stood in my kitchen, and she cooked, moving around the space with the ease of someone who knows where everything lives, and I sat at the table and watched her, and the house had the warmth of a house with 2 people in it, and outside the October leaves were turning on the birch trees along Birchwood Lane red and gold in the late afternoon light. December came back around the way December always does without asking permission, settling into Connecticut, like an old coat that fits because it has been worn so many times. I was in the garage on a Saturday afternoon, working on the hinge of the side door that had been sticking since August. The kind of small, persistent problem that a person of reasonable intelligence addresses immediately, and that I had been walking past for 4 months, because there was always something else that needed doing first. The radio was on a station out of Hartford that plays standards on weekend afternoons, and the light through the garage window was the particular low gold of a December afternoon, angled and thin, the kind of light that makes everything look considered. I heard Claire's car in the driveway before I saw it. She had bought herself a used Volvo in March, practical and reliable, the choice of a woman who had decided that her decisions were going to reflect what she actually needed, rather than what looked appropriate in a particular driveway. I heard the engine cut, and the door open, and her footsteps on the path. And then she appeared in the garage doorway, the way she used to appear in doorways when she was young, filling the frame, not because of her size, but because of the quality of attention she brought with her, the way some people make a room aware of itself simply by entering it. She was wearing her work coat, the good charcoal one she had bought when she started the hotel project, and she had a bag over one shoulder, and her hair was loose, and she looked like herself in the specific way that takes a long time to look like again after you have spent years looking like someone else's idea of you. "You're still working on that hinge," she said. "I'm working on it right now," I said. "You've been working on it since August." Things take the time they take. She came in and set her bag on the workbench and looked around the garage the way she always looked around it, with the particular attention of a designer who cannot help cataloging a space even when she is not working. She had rearranged the tool wall last spring when she came by to help me install new shelving, and the arrangement she had come up with was better than the one I had lived with for 12 years, which I had told her, and which she had received with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has been seeing solutions to things all her life and is finally in a position to implement them. "How's the Hartford project?" I said. "Good." She leaned against the workbench with her arms crossed, the posture of someone settling in for a real conversation rather than a brief one. "We finished the East Wing this week. The light in those rooms in the morning is exactly what I wanted. I had to fight for the window placement with the contractor, but I got it." "Good for you," I said. He thought I was being difficult. "Were you?" "I was being right," she said. "Which sometimes looks the same." I set the hinge tool down and looked at my daughter and thought about Margaret saying almost exactly that sentence in this same garage 20 years ago. about a different contractor and a different window, and the specific continuity of it moved through me in the way that things move through you when you are 67 and you have been paying attention long enough to see the lines that connect one moment to another across decades. Dad, Claire said, "Can I ask you something? You can always ask me something." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the workbench, at the organized rows of tools at the old Buick, sitting in its usual spot with the particular dignity of a thing that has earned its place through reliable service rather than appearance. "Do you ever regret it?" she said. "Not stepping in sooner? Not saying something the first time you noticed things were wrong?" I thought about that question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. "Every day," I said. "And also no." She looked at me. "Every day because you were hurting, and I saw pieces of it, and I told myself you were an adult, and it wasn't mine to manage," I said. "No, because if I had stepped in when I first noticed, you would have defended him. You would have defended the marriage. You would have explained to me all the reasons things were fine because you were still inside it, and you couldn't see the shape of it yet." I picked the tool back up and turned it in my hands. "Some doors have to be opened from the inside. I couldn't open it for you. I could only be standing there when you were ready to open it yourself." Claire absorbed this for a long time. Outside, the light had shifted, the December afternoon moving toward its early dark, the birch trees along the edge of the yard going silver in the dusk. The radio played something slow and familiar that I could not name, but knew the way you know things that were present during important years of your life. "Mom would have liked tonight," Claire said. "Not a question." "She would have cooked something complicated," I said, "and acted like it was nothing." Claire smiled. "And made you do the dishes." "Always." She pushed off from the workbench and walked to the Buick and put her hand flat on the hood, the way you put your hand on the shoulder of something that has been steadfast an acknowledgement rather than an affection. "This car is still ugly," she said. "It started this morning." "That's a low bar." "It's a reliable bar," I said. "Low and reliable is underrated." She laughed, and it went up into the garage rafters and came back down, and I let it fill the space before I said anything else. "Are you staying for dinner?" I asked. "I brought groceries," she said, lifting the bag from the workbench. "Pasta. I found Mom's recipe, the one with the lemon." I set the hinge tool down on the workbench beside the radio, and I turned off the lamp above the bench, and I looked at the garage for a moment, in the remaining light, at the organized tools and the old car and the door with the fixed hinge that finally swung the way it was supposed to swing. And I thought about 31 years of work and one December night and all the distance between the man I was in that boardroom on Asylum Avenue and the man standing in this garage in Wethersfield with grease on his hands and his daughter waiting in the kitchen. The distance was not what I had expected. It was shorter in some ways and longer in others, and mostly it was just the distance you travel when you do the work in front of you and pay attention and show up when it matters and let the rest of it find its own level. I followed Claire into the house. The kitchen light was on and warm, and she was already at the counter setting things out in her organized way, and the house had the sound of itself, the way it had not had in years, occupied and purposeful, and outside through the kitchen window, the first snow of December was starting small and unhurried, taking its time. I washed my hands at the sink. "Smells good already," I said. "I haven't started yet," she said. "I know," I said. "It smells good anyway." There is a moment in every family story when you realize the ending was always there, waiting quietly in the beginning, like a door that was never locked, only never tried. I am 67 years old. I drove an old car and fixed things in my garage and let people decide what I was worth by the shoes I wore. I do not regret any of it. But I do regret the months I spent watching and waiting when my daughter needed me to move. If this grandpa stories taught me anything, it is this: patience is a virtue until it becomes an excuse. Do not be like me. Do not wait for the moment to be perfect before you step between your child and the thing that is hurting them. The moment is never perfect. You step anyway. I believe that God does not give us the people we love, so we can stand at a distance and observe them disappearing. He gives them to us so we can show up. Imperfectly, incompletely, in old cars on cold December nights, but present. Always present. This has been one man's family story, and it is true in the ways that matter. If any part of it reached you tonight, I would be grateful to know. Leave a comment below and tell me about the quiet person in your own life that nobody ever saw coming. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if these grandpa stories mean something to you, subscribe so the next one finds you. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements constructed for the purpose of exploring real human experiences. If this kind of content is not for you, we respect that completely, and we wish you well on your way to something that is.